Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne, Australia, welcoming you to my channel if you've just found me for the first time. I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids without any help from grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers or equipment, really just me and them struggling along together either inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers of the world, if that sounds like your bag, do hit subscribe. I post every Friday. The ramblings of an amateur are what you're going to get, but if that might help you in your orchid journey, come along. And today, here is a video I never thought I'd make. Plant lovers, epidendrums. Now, there are epidendrums and there are epidendrums and there are epidendrums. But this one I think is incredibly common in Australia, and they're commonly called crucifix orchids, and the most common species ancestor of these is Epidendrum radicans. And there are now lots and lots and lots of hybrids with lots and lots of different colors, which are probably drawn on a little bit of the other species types. But basically, this is your very common or garden epidendrum, which is easily found in Australia. And perhaps, plant lovers, familiarity bred contempt. And so I haven't really pursued epidendrums, I have to say, because, well, to be honest, there's actually not much skill involved in growing them here, I must say, because hashtag blessed, our climate is really, really suited to growing these. So it's kind of foolproof. So what is there to say? Well, I thought I'd just give you my ramblings because I have had a few experiences with epidendrums, and it culminated with me popping into my favourite nursery, Fitzroy Nursery, which I'll put the link below, which often has a small selection of orchids. It depends on the season. There's usually a large amount of oncidium types. Sometimes in early spring, there's a lot of Australian dendrobium types, but it really depends on growers and availability. But last time I was there, I always go to the trolley of death, the sale table, and there was this, half price. And I just really loved the colour. Look at that. It's the beautiful mauve with those little white tips to the lip. Absolutely beautiful. And I thought, you know what, Epidendrum, you're coming home with me. I'm going to put aside my prejudice and I'm going to grow you. And so here we are. And in fact, I have a couple more. So in the early days of my orchid growing career, I saw a picture of a classic orange Epidendrum radicans, the crucifix orchid, as it's commonly called, on Facebook Marketplace. And I thought, oh, I must have it. So I went on quite a long car journey to go and buy this orchid, bring it back, and it flowered, and I actually grew it inside. So we'll get to that in a minute. And it flowered, and then I realized it is as common as muck, and I could have just gone to the local hardware store and bought one. But anyway, that was the beginning of my epidendrum journey. So from that point, I've never really engaged with them since. However, I did inherit a rescue epidendrum. So I've made a cymbidium rescue video about a cymbidium that I found in the backyard of my father-in-law, who is 94 this year, actually, still going strong. I'll link that video above. And his wife, my partner's mother, who died over 20 years ago, had a shade house out the back in the back garden and grew lots of orchids. So this would have been in the late 70s, early 80s. And there wasn't a huge amount of variety there and easily available in Australia. So she had epidendrums, cymbidiums, and Australian dendrobiums. Well, they were the three that were left alive, because after she died, basically that whole area was just left, and the shade cloth had fallen in, the plants were on their side, and they were in full sun getting no care. So they got occasional rain, and a lot of the pots were actually on their side, so it was a miracle any moisture got in. And the epidendrum, the cymbidium, and the Australian dendrobium were still alive. So I rescued them all, repotted them, and they all bloomed. The cymbidium bloomed, and I was able to show John that, which I'll put a bit of that footage in here. And the epidendrum was a classic orange one that bloomed, and I think I've got a picture of that which I'll pop in. And in fact, the Australian dendrobium bloomed, so there you are. Anyway, so by default then, I had two almost identical orange epidendrum radicans, and thought, yeah, enough. However, look, plant lovers, this has led me down the straight path of collecting more. Now though, there are so many colors. There are reds, every version of orange and yellow. There are whites. There are every version of pinks and purples. There are some with much more distinct color variation from the lip to the petals and sepals. So there's anything you could possibly want. And so I'm thinking, as we progress to moving, goodness knows whenever that will be, but it will be, I'm going to use these orange epidendrums in a particular way. But anyway, let's not get to that just yet. Let's dive into basic care for these orchids, because I think for a beginner, they're incredibly rewarding and very easy, whether you're growing them indoors or you're in a climate that they can grow outdoors. So let's go through Epidendrum Care 101. Bearing in mind, I'm an ambivalent epidendrum grower. First things first, Epidendrum radicans. And although this is a hybrid, it's not the species, it's got a lot of radicans blood in it. So we can talk about that name. So epidendrum, as we know, comes from the Greek epidendron, meaning upon a tree. Ironically though, that name was given to lots of different orchids in the 18th century. This one is kind of more of a scrambler and more of a terrestrial, lithophyte, opportunistic orchid actually. So it can certainly clamber and through and up things, but it's not necessarily your classic epiphyte, I don't think. And it does incredibly well planted in soil. I mean, soil, we'll get to that though in a minute. Now, radicans is another interesting botanic term in that it means that the stem will grow roots, and often it means the stem will sort of loll along the ground, produce roots, which can then obviously take root and produce new plants, and that's how the plant can vegetatively grow and expand its domain. So you'll often see radicans as a suffix in lots and lots of different plant genre, not necessarily orchids, but all manner of things. You'll find radicans at the end, and it means that they have a stem that will loll up, touch the floor, touch the ground, and produce roots and root. It also means they're obviously quite easy to propagate because you can quite simply snip it off and root that bit that's got a root. Anyway, Epidendrum radicans. The natural habitat for these orchids is basically sort of Central America. So the far south of North America, Central America, and the far north of South America. So that sort of that band. And quite diverse, from low sort of sea level all the way up to quite high altitudes. So, which is something else we're going to get to. That is a variety of temperatures, which means a variety of care. Well, actually, no, a variety of temperatures that it can take. So there we go. We've got the name. We know where it comes from. Conditions. Now, you see these a lot in Melbourne, and you see them throughout Australia, actually. And it is actually a plant that can take full sun. It's one of those rare orchids that can take full sun on its leaves and thrive. Now, as with many orchids, particularly say the Australian dendrobium types, if you do have your plant in full sun, including full afternoon sun, you might well get burns on them. If though the plant has kind of been in that condition for a while from a seedling, or you've acclimatized it to full sun, the leaves are probably going to be able to withstand full sun. So if you buy a plant or you acquire a division or a cutting and you put it directly in full sun and it hasn't been, you might well get some leaf damage until it sort of hardens up. And like many orchids, these leaves do hang around for a while. But good news is it's a very vigorous grower, so you will get new growth pretty quickly, and your sin of burning will be forgiven quickly because the leaves will drop off and those old canes can move on. So you have this quite upright habit. Now, it's upright because it's been clipped to this cane. So what it wants to do though is lollop along the ground and then find something that it can sort of grow through and up without clinging. It's sort of a messy scrambler, and that is a bit of a negative in terms of growing it because the plants can just lollop about, and it's what they want to do. However, like in this case, you can easily stake the canes, but the canes can get 4.5 feet, you know, at least a meter, if not 1.5 meters. So they can get quite tall. There's a lot of staking, but anyway, if you want to present them well, it is a good idea to stake them because it wants to loll up and it wants those roots growing along the stem to find earth, create a new plant and move on. So full sun, you are not going to get great blooms if you don't give it really, really bright light and as much direct light as you can. So that's the thing about growing them inside, but we'll get to that in a minute. You will get lots of great vegetative growth if you don't have enough light, and that's not a problem as long as eventually you can put it in the right light and then gently transition it into that condition so that it's getting a little bit more direct light every day until it's hardened off and then it can go in its full light position. So if you're growing them outside, now I'm here in Melbourne and we don't have the same zonal systems as you do in the States. So Melbourne's climate is kind of described as warm temperate or cool Mediterranean. So we do get rain in summer, which a classic Mediterranean climate wouldn't, but we don't get freezing winters. But we do get hot summers, but it can rain. There you go. I think climatically we're not that dissimilar to the Bay regions of California. Anyway, essentially it doesn't freeze. That's the critical thing. And we do get quite a lot of sunshine in winter. And I would say, from a casual observation, that Melbourne is probably as far south in Australia that I've seen these growing outside happily. I think anything that is just a bit colder and more prolonged is just not going to enable the plant to get through the winter well. Anyway, I've also though seen them growing outside quite far north. I think the furthest north I've seen them is north of Brisbane, so that's the subtropics. And I haven't actually been looking, but I'm sure they're probably further north into the proper tropical conditions. So that is a huge range. That is a plant that can go from essentially a tropical climate all the way down to a temperate / cool temperate climate. So that's quite a tough plant. So if you are in any of those ranges of climates, you'll be able to grow Epidendrum radicans and the hybrids thereof outside easily. And I have seen them growing in many locations. So I've seen them growing in planters where they're just dangling. I've seen them growing in public spaces, in lobbies, in massive pots, lolling. I've actually seen them growing epiphytically. So in a wonderful nursery called Royrama down near Geelong here in Melbourne, the nursery there has them growing in the tops of Canary Island palms. So where the fronds are cut and you have that sort of material that builds up as the tree matures, there's lots of space for aerial roots to get in. So although I just said it's not kind of classically epiphytic, the nursery person there planted some of those plants in that crown of the palm tree. And as the tree progresses and grows, the orchid is growing with it. And it looks incredible, absolutely incredible to see these wonderful flower spikes hanging out from the tops of this palm tree. It looked very tropical in an area that certainly isn't. And I've also seen them almost growing like a hedge. I went again to pick up a plant from Facebook Marketplace, and I pulled up to the house and there was a low brick wall in front of the front door, like a little sort of porch veranda area. And he had just a hedge of different coloured epidendrums in front of the door, all in bloom, and they were all about chest height. And it was just wonderful. So as you walked along the path to the front door, you walked through this sort of alley of epidendrums in bloom. And because they can basically bloom all year, depending if they're getting enough light, you've kind of always got blooms. So it was really beautiful, which led me to think, how can I use epidendrums in our new house? So we are going to have planters on a roof terrace, and it's above a garage, and these things want to loll. So I think all those orange classic crucifix orchids that I've got, Epidendrum radicans, I'm going to plant in that area with plumbago, which is blue. So blue and orange kind of clash, but they actually looked quite good together when mine accidentally bloomed next to each other. So I'm going to have this tumble of orange and blue. So that's where I'm going to grow them. They're going to get pretty much direct sun. They'll get a bit of protection in the afternoon actually, but they will be exposed to rain. And I won't make much of an effort to water them sort of out of sync, as it were, from the natural condition. So the other thing that one can observe about Epidendrum radicans in Australia is that they really are drought tolerant. They can take the vagaries of rainfall, so they can go quite a long period without water, which is interesting because they actually don't sort of have pseudobulbs. So they're basically this cane-like structure, but very tough, very succulent leaves. So it's, I think, a very resilient plant. It can take hot, it can take cold, it can take dry, it can take wet as long as it's well drained. So I think if you were going to plant them in your garden, firstly, it kind of likes quite poor soils, so sandy soils, rocky soils. It often grows in nooks in rocky areas where a bit of matter has collected. So that would be ideal for it, which sounds brilliant. If you've got a bad patch of nasty soil in direct sun where nothing will grow, try an epidendrum. But just make sure that wherever that space is, that the soil is free draining, because it can take many things, but I don't think it's going to like soggy feet. The other thing that sets Epidendrum radicans apart from its other species cousins is that it does grow roots up the stem, because that's what radicans means. which means it's incredibly easy to propagate. Now, with these big orange plants that I've inherited, I've got two in massive pots just lolling about all over the place. I've just ignored them, to be honest. When they bloom, I'm very happy, and then I ignore them so they don't get watered. They just live their best lives on their own. But moving them, I often snap bits off because they've got these very lolling canes. And even if it doesn't have a visible root, I will just stick it in a pot and it will root from a leaf node. So bear that in mind. Incredibly easy to propagate from cuttings are Epidendrum radicans. So otherwise, condition-wise then outside, I don't think heat is necessarily the issue. It's sunlight. It needs light. And obviously it doesn't want to be cold for a long period because it doesn't come from those sorts of climates. But basically, if you've got enough sunlight and mild winters, give it a whirl outside. Now, inside culture, kind of the same. You've got to sort of replicate that condition. Now this one, I bought it and it's potted in medium bark. It's quite fancy, I think, for an epidendrum. As I said, they'll grow in gardens, well, certainly here in Melbourne and east coast of Australia. So they'll take garden conditions, again, as long as it's well drained. But if you're growing it indoors in a pot, then I would just use either a medium bark or even an out-of-the-bag orchid mix from a hardware store that's quite cheap, because it doesn't really need such great care when it comes to the potting material, I don't think. So you don't need to worry about sphagnum moss or mixes. I would just either go for a medium bark or a very easy to access orchid mix. Whatever it is, it just has to be free draining because that's what this plant will need. Now, the plant of mine that I grew inside for about 2 years did flower very well. I had it, the pot against a wall. It was actually a west-facing window because I didn't have any north-facing windows, which is the southern hemisphere, the sunniest bit. So it really only ever got afternoon sun, but it still got enough direct sun to stimulate the flowering. So even though it wasn't in perfect conditions, it did get enough direct light to flower, and it was always in bloom. But a great lollopy thing it was, though, because the light wasn't great, it did grow up to the light, so it was difficult to manage. Now again, like most orchids, it does benefit from being pot bound. It is quite a vigorous grower, so you will get new canes fairly constantly, probably more towards the spring, summer, warmer seasons, but mine do send up shoots all the time. But it does do well being quite contained. So saying, I've got both of mine in quite large terracotta pots and they have filled it and they're lolloping about. And if I snap a bit off by accident, I just stick it back in the pot to increase the bulk of the plant. But you could grow it in anything, plastic, terracotta, whatever world of potting you're in, go for it. Then the thing is, firstly, its growth habit, it's going to be tall, but I think there are actually hybrids out there now that are shorter, so they'll be easier to manage from an indoor perspective. But if you've got sort of the classic epidendrum, you're going to have to bear that in mind. You are going to have like at least a meter or a couple of feet of plant growth with the flowers at the top to contend with. And that whole part of the plant, or at least the top, but a lot of the leaves, is going to need to get direct sun if it can. So wherever you are, if you're in the northern hemisphere, that'll be a south-facing area. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, a north-facing window where the plant can get direct light, at least for sort of half the day as the sun's moving around. That will be great. Which is quite good because there's not that many indoor plants that, apart from sort of cacti and succulents, that you can put in a window and get full sun and they're going to enjoy it. So actually grow this with succulents and cacti. So when you do water it, just drench it and then allow it to dry out. Again, don't overthink it, but don't overwater it. Don't overwater and don't overthink. It is something I feel that does like to dry out. So that would be my only tip with watering. Feeding wise, true confession, super lazy. I do throw literally a handful of slow release fertilizer pellets on mine that are outdoors in spring. And that is just a generic flowering plant slow release fertilizer. Doesn't really matter what it is. And that gives it enough juice, I think, for the whole year. If you wanted to give it more care, you could. You could then liquid feed it throughout the year as you would your other orchids. As it can bloom and grow throughout the year too, you might not want to slow that down in winter. It depends what your plant's doing. But I wouldn't be feeding it as much in those cooler periods. And that food could be any sort of liquid fertilizer, one that's aimed particularly at orchids, or one that's a flowering plant liquid fertilizer, or a general liquid fertilizer for plants. You could also use tonics, so things that are seaweed based or the runoff from worm farms. That's very, very nutritious. So you just dilute all of those things to about 1/10 of the recommended dose and off you go. So flowering wise, as you can see, hang on, let me smell this. I've never thought to smell it. No, no fragrance. As you can see, the flower spike comes from the apex of the cane. So you get one cane that grows very, very long, and then its sort of final act is to produce a flower spike, which then produces quite a long cane. And it can keep flowering for months. So if it's getting the right conditions, you'll basically just get this stem growing and growing and growing and keeping producing flower buds and opening successively. So it can get a bit ugly too, because you might end up with quite a bit of a denuded stalk with the flowers at the top. So you will often see quite long flower spikes with the sort of pom-pom heads at the top. But I would just let it go. Just let it keep going until it basically gives up the juice, and then that flower spike will die and you can trim it off. Now that cane won't bloom again. So you can, if you want to encourage more growth, cut it as long as there are other canes. If you actually accidentally snap a bit off or cut it, it will actually re-sprout from a node and produce a new cane, and that will bloom. So you could even just prune it to get more growth, which I've done accidentally by snapping them off. But essentially, once that cane has bloomed from the top, it's never going to flower again because it only flowers from the top. It won't ever produce flower spikes from the side of the plant. So there we are, plant lovers. Epidendrum radicans and their hybrid offspring, a really great plant for beginners no matter what your conditions. So if you can grow succulents and cacti well in your inside environment, you'll be able to grow this one. And in fact, if you can grow them outside, you'll be able to grow this one too, because it actually looks and feels quite a lot like a succulent plant. And it does kind of like the similar conditions. Probably maybe just a little bit more water consistently than cacti or succulents, which do, if you're growing them in cooler conditions, do like to dry out much more in winter. But again, it's really tough and resilient. If you do forget it, it will survive. And if you go on holiday and don't water it, it's going to still be alive when you get back and probably still in bloom. So plant lovers, I think I am changing my mind about Epidendrum radicans. It is a plant that you can put in a pot, leave in a sunny spot and just ignore, and it will just lollop about and grow and flower for you and be a great space filler in a tricky spot. The other thing that you can do, you can buy these sort of funnel shaped supports for tomato bushes from hardware stores. Quite easy, quite inexpensive. So what I've done is plant my epidendrums in the middle of one of these tomato supports. So the plant kind of grows up and lolls, and it's slightly more contained and more upright. So the plant looks a bit more contained, a bit neater, and you do get more of a chance to see the flowers. As to the common name crucifix, I don't really get it. I don't see what the reference is, really. It doesn't look like a crucifix. It doesn't particularly look symbolic of what happened on a crucifix. I'm not quite sure where that comes from. Anyway, maybe it's just the nature of the flower spike. I don't know. Anyway, but generally the flowers are all pretty similar in their structure, quite star-like with quite a pronounced lip, and the hybridization is the thing that's developed the colors of the petals and sepals and the lip in the middle. And one of the things about Epidendrum radicans is that the flower is essentially upside down. And the word for that is resupinate, which means upside down. So you can see that it does look as though the flower's upside down. Anyway, there you are. A very, very charming plant. Now, this has no name. It is called Epidendrum Crucifix Orchid. So there's no name for this hybrid in case you're desperate to get the same thing. There are so many though out there. I'm sure basically you just go for whatever color you want, I think. And if you want variations on the lips, but basically primary colors, and I think I have seen white ones as well, and lots of sort of versions of pinks and purples. So there you go. No name, hybrid Epidendrum. I've changed my mind about them. I think I'm going to really go for it, I think, in our new house, because there's lots of spots where they can grow. Anyway, plant lovers, I hope you've loved our ramble down Epidendrum way. If you've got any, I'd love to know how they're going for you in whatever spot of the world you are in. And I look very much forward to seeing you next week. Who knows what the adventure will be, but it will be on Friday. So hit subscribe if you want to find out what it is. But I look forward to seeing you then.